Firstly, welcome everyone. It's fantastic to have such wonderful attendance for what is going to be a really fabulous conversation. We feel so fortunate to have Professor Novak here joining us for this seminar on disruptive ideas brought to you all by the Melbourne School of Government, today focusing on government innovation and public engagement. As some of you might have seen, just a note, because I can hear a bit of an echo, if those people who aren't speaking at any moment can just make an effort to keep themselves on mute so we can make sure we can hear the one flow of conversation, that would be great. Also, very much encourage people to have their videos on. We're going to make this as interactive as we can so that you have the opportunity to shape the conversation and ask your pressing questions in the time that we have available. Now, before we get underway, I want to introduce myself. My name is Holly Ransom, for those I haven't met. I'm very privileged to be an honorary fellow here at the Melbourne School of Government and very fortunate as well to serve as MC for today's event. And before we get underway, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting. I'm joining from Wurundjeri land, and I wish to acknowledge the traditional custodians and elders of the East Kulin Nation. And acknowledging as well that we have people joining from across Australia and the world today, I would like to extend that acknowledgement to the elders of all those lands. And I'd like to recognise the traditional owners' continuing connection to land, waters and community, and pay my respects to them and their cultures, to elders past, present and emerging. Now, before we get underway, I want to introduce two of the people that are spotlighted on your screen. I'm sure Professor Novak needs no introduction, but I'm going to give her one anyway. It's one of the great joys of my job, getting to tell you just how amazing the people that we have in conversation with you today are. So Professor Beth Novak is a professor in technology, culture and society at New York University's Tandon School of Engineering. She directs the Governance Lab, or Gov Lab, and is a MacArthur Research and its MacArthur Research Network on opening governance. Her current research focus is around people-led innovation, namely the ability of communities and institutions to work together to solve problems more effectively and legitimately. She's a prolific author, including most recently of Solving Public Problems, that she published in 2021. Smart Citizens, Smarter State, Wiki Government, State of Play, you name it. I encourage you to actually go and look at the full list of titles. There's quite a number that you can go and read there. So welcome, Professor Novak. It's wonderful to have you here. And before I pass over to you, I'm going to hand over to wonderful Timothy Kariotis, who's here. He's a research fellow in regulation and design at the Melbourne School of Government. He's also a PhD candidate at the University's School of Computing and Information Systems, where his PhD actually focuses on information privacy in the design of digital mental health technologies. So Tim, just to give us a bit of context for this series that you've been so integral to putting together, why don't you take it away?
Thanks, Holly, and thanks so much, Beth, for joining us. We really appreciate to have your knowledge and experience here on the call with us today. I just welcome everyone. This is our third in a series of seminars on digital government, on government innovation and transformation. And I think this is the one I've been most excited about because it kind of brings together so much of what we've spoken about so far and opens up many more pathways for future conversations, which I hope we can have in the coming weeks and months. As Holly said, my name's Timothy Kariotis. I'm kind of leading the digital government push here at the Melbourne School of Government, and I've been really lucky to teach a number of undergraduate students in this space, and I'm always inspired by the different disciplinary perspectives on what is a transformation of the way we do government and think about policy. I want to start by continuing the acknowledgement of our traditional custodians of the land. I'm also here on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, so let me extend my respects to elders past and present, but also elders who are calling in from different land that we are meeting on today. I'm going to keep these opening remarks quite brief so we can hear more from Professor Novak, but I wanted to just reflect on the fact that we're meeting at a time where it feels like democracy and our public spaces are under great strain, not just from COVID, but also from polarization, from, I don't want to say it, but the metaverse, and from a number of different factors that can leave us feeling quite lacking in hope. And I want to reflect on this and then provide some things that are making me feel quite hopeful as we move into the seminar today. I've spent a lot of my last few years at the School of Government thinking about public participation in digital spaces, in digital health, in data governance, and I've spent a lot of my career thinking about the participation of young people. I've been really inspired by Professor Novak's work on the idea of crowd law, the idea that we can use different tools at our disposal to allow individuals and communities to contribute to the legislative and policymaking process. I think this idea has a lot of strength in the Australian context, where we do see certain interest groups holding a lot of sway over our policy-making process. If that's the fossil fuel industry guiding our climate policy, or in my home state of Tasmania, the gambling industry guiding our, really shifting the focus of our communities away from things that could strengthen them. So I think there's lots to say about how we can enable individuals and communities to have their voice heard at the policy-making table. Recently, I've looked around at our Victorian community. We're one of the longest places that have been in lockdown, and that has caused a lot of strains on our feelings of community, on our feelings of feeling part of something bigger that we can contribute to. And we see that both on the left and the right of our political spectrum. And sometimes it can feel like there isn't a lot of hope for having a public discourse that is worth contributing to. But I think that sometimes these things that get portrayed in the media can seem overwhelming, where there's lots of good stuff. And as I said, my work has been mostly with young people. And when I look at the work young people are doing, I feel more hope than despair. So I wanted to finish my remarks by sharing some of the things that have made me quite hopeful in the last year before I pass back to Holly and Professor Novak. So the first thing that's making me feel quite hopeful about public participation and the strength of our democracy is recent local council elections. In my local area of Brimbank and Maribyrnong City Councils, we've seen some of the youngest mayors elected. In Brimbank City Council, we've had Jasmine Nguyen, a 24-year-old Vietnamese woman, elected as mayor. And next door in Maribyrnong City Council, we've had Anthony Tran, a 22-year-old Vietnamese Australian man, elected. I think those are amazing feats of young people stepping up to be the voice of their community. I was inspired by Jack, Wesley and Darcy, the three young people who established COVID Base Australia, which has been helping guide the public discussion on the COVID pandemic. These are young people who are still in school but are contributing to the public discourse above and beyond what I ever thought a young person could contribute. Here at the School of Government, we've got the Pathways to Politics for Women program, which I think is, it's been running since 2015, and I think is a great example of how we as a university can contribute to creating a more equal and broad discussion in our political space. The program has had great success, with 13 of the program alumni joining the different levels of political government from local, state and federal. And only recently it has been recognised with the Eve Malib Gender-Wise Philanthropy Award to kind of show the amazing work it's been doing and the amazing work that has been inspired across the country with similar programs. I think we've all been inspired by the School Strike the Climate movement started by Greta Thunberg. I think that just shows us that young people aren't willing to wait for those of us who are holding them back to get out of the way. They want to have their voices heard. We've also seen that from Grace Tame and Brittany Higgins, who has raised the profile of sexual assault in our country and the culture of toxic masculinity that have pervaded our politics for too long. Also people like Taylor Gray, a 24-year-old Wurundjeri woman who fought to organise Black Lives Matters protest in Newcastle and put her own rights on the line to make sure voices could be heard. Just a reflection on my own career that got me here thinking about these topics. I've been lucky enough to work with Youth Without Borders, NCD3, One Woman Project, UN Youth Australia. And throughout that journey, I've seen so many young people stepping up to the plate to bat for their communities and to make sure the voices of young people and vulnerable groups have been heard. And I think that is only promising for the future of our country and our democracy. So thank you, Beth, for being here. I'm so excited to hear your thoughts and perspectives, especially what's happening in the United States. And Holly, I'll pass back to you to continue the discussion.
Thank you, Timothy, both for setting the context of this series and what we're aiming to really facilitate here at the Melbourne School of Government with this disruptive set of seminars. But also for, I just think, at a time when, as you said, it's all too easy to be a little bit bleak about things, for the focus you brought to so many great optimistic call outs and things that we can really take as positive signs. Now, just to give everyone a lay of the land for how we're going to run this morning's session, I'm going to invite some opening remarks from Professor Novak, then we're going to go into questions. And I really invite you from the moment we open that up, by all means, to put your hand up if you'd like to unmute and ask a question. I'll turn to people as we go, but also feel free to put your questions in the chat. And I have an endless supply should we need them, but I really welcome your opportunity to step in and direct the conversation. But with that, Professor Novak, I might throw to you. Opening reflections, I guess perhaps taking Timothy's sort of setting the scene as a prompt. I would love your take on how optimistic you're feeling at this moment and what it is that you're paying attention to and watching in this space, both as challenges we need to lean into and opportunities.
Thank you so very much for having me here. I couldn't be more delighted, and it's just so excited and hopeful because I have postdoc positions open, Timothy, and I hope you're going to apply. We need people with your level of optimism and enthusiasm, and I'm just so excited, and I would love to put it to everybody here. Timothy's kind of charge with regard to what you are hopeful and optimistic about. We're coming out of Thanksgiving in the United States, where people like to exchange messages of gratitude and optimism. So I think it would be great if you're not driving a car to hear from you in the chat, whether there are things that you're really excited about in this space around governance innovation, resident engagement, and public problem solving that really have captivated your imagination recently. That said, this very much should be a conversation. So comments, questions, reflections. I am not going to give a lecture. That was the agreement. It's dinner time where I am on a very cold night. So I am as eager to learn from you and to hear from you about what's going on down under. I'm hoping to be there in April, COVID permitting, but it's been a little while and I've had to postpone several trips. So I am hungering for your news and eager to hear what's going on with you and what your work and what you're seeing as you come out of lockdown. And as we emerge, we hope with COVID, it's by no means behind us, but at least as we resume a new normal living with COVID, perhaps for the foreseeable future, what it's meant for your work and what you're optimistic about. So that said, let me start with a couple of reflections, and then we'll get right away into conversation. And what I've been, and for those of you who don't know, I wear several different hats. I am a professor at the university. I've moved to Northeastern University now in order to head up a new Center for Social Change and Social Impact. But I continue my work as the Chief Innovation Officer for the state of New Jersey. And what I've been very excited about, and these two things are related, because really coming out of the work that we've done during COVID, the great lessons that we've learned from really tackling the acute challenges of the pandemic that required my team to spring into action and do just an enormous amount of work, as well as work that we've done kind of working on more chronic challenges. I chair the state's Future of Work Task Force, and we deal with issues of long-term issues of economic inequality, racial inequity, and other longer term problems, as well as then the looming challenges of technology for the quality and future of work, as well as then the broader questions about what this means for trust in institutions and for faith in democracy. Really the lesson coming out of all of this is that when we apply different ways of working, ways that involve uses of data and uses of engagement, we can be more effective at getting things done. So I have a litany of examples and stories I can tell you both from my own work and from what I'm seeing as a researcher looking at what's going on around the world, is that when people have been more agile in the way that they do things, when they have turned to residents in their own communities, to other governments to get ideas, to come to experts around the world, so to a variety of different stakeholders to get smart quickly, when they have collaborated across sectors with government, universities, and private sector to be able to implement change faster, we have been able to get things done much, much more effectively. And so there is, that said, there is really a set of skills that I think we have seen marshaled by the most successful public entrepreneurs, by the people who have been effective, especially at responding to COVID. I'm happy to talk about what those skills are for a moment, but let me just say that there is a set of skills and practices that we can cultivate to help us do better at doing our jobs. These skills are not innate. They are not something we were taught in school. They are not something we were taught, even if we went to school for public administration, we were not taught these things. The top 25 schools for public administration in the United States do not have a requirement that you learn data science. They do not teach you how to do community engagement. In the survey that I conducted with my new faculty at Northeastern, we had 500 respondents, and I asked people, what are the things that you do in the world? What do you think are the things that are most impactful in the world? And do you do them? And when you ask people about making policy or engaging with communities, they uniformly tell you these are the most important things you could be doing, but they tell you they don't know how to do them. So that's people in universities. I'm not just talking about people in governments here more generally, but the point being that there's skills that we are not often trained in because the people who teach us don't know them and don't know how to teach us them. And so I think it's really, really important, even as we think about the big policy changes that we need to combat climate change, to fight racism, to promote public health, and to do the things that are front and center for us now. I think it's important that even within these broader discussions about big policies that we need, about institutional changes that we need, about governance changes that we need, to really focus on what the individual skill building is that each of us needs to engage in and that we need to promote in our institutions if we're to foster more effective service delivery and more effective policy making. Even something as simple as the ability to write a memo is not something that everybody learns and knows how to do. So when we sent out an email today to invite people to a workshop on memo writing, we got 100 signups in the first hour. And that's from one email to public servants in one jurisdiction, simply because there is so much of a hunger for professional development, for further learning, and for capacity building and for upskilling. So let me stop by saying briefly that those skills for me, and not just for me, but for places like the OECD and Bloomberg Philanthropies, and even, and when I say me, I also include ANSOG and other partners who are in the governance innovation space, really are a combination of qualitative and quantitative skills that start with the ability to define a problem and its root causes, to do so using both data and resident engagement, or what we might think of as human-centered design, the ability to identify solutions to problems by doing rapid evidence reviews, or what some people like to call evidence synthesis or fast field scanning, and the ability to practice open innovation, that is to say, to go out and, again, talk to communities to come up with solutions about how to solve problems. It's a set of skills about how to implement the solutions that we develop by partnering across sectors in ways that actually make us more agile, more capable, and more legitimate in the way that we do things. And of course, to measure what works and to evaluate and scale our progress, again, using data and using engagement to be able to do both of those things more effectively. So whether it's defining the problem, solving the problem, implementing solutions, or evaluating and scaling the kind of basic steps in a policy or service delivery process, I think it's important that we learn how to accelerate what we're doing, how to put that on steroids, if you will, by using both data and engagement to be able to do so. But the ability to do so is not innate. It's really easy. And I think, you know, Timothy, you've talked about things like crowd law and engagement. It's in principle, it's so obvious that we should talk to citizens. In practice, it is so incredibly hard, as I'm sure you can attest, whether it's the lawyers telling you you can't do it, whether it's the lack of culture and practice for doing it, whether it's the lack of access to platforms and the inability to procure them, whether it's the lack of know-how about how do you arrange an engagement with citizens, especially people from non-dominant and minoritized communities. It's just not something we necessarily know how to do. So there's a huge amount of need for investment in infrastructure, including platforms and the contracts for those platforms, including the data that tells us what works, but above all in the skill building that can really help us develop the culture and capacity for working in new ways. The most forward-leaning governments are doing just that, and they're investing heavily in public sector upskilling and thinking about what the future of work is for the public sector, not only for the private sector. So let me stop with that and see where you want to take the conversation in every and all direction. And I'm going to go read the chat for exciting and
Lots of
interesting
comments coming
stories.
through in the chat already. And as I said, please feel free to put questions in the chat as we go, or to put your hand up virtually and we can unmute and engage you in the conversation. Professor Novak, thank you for those opening remarks. I think really interesting that challenge you sort of threw down there, that we need to be really thinking about this defined set of skills that we need in our future kind of public leaders, and what it is that allows effectiveness moving forward. And a really interesting call out that's not well taught, that's not well known. If we can double click there for a minute before we kind of take ourselves in other directions, how do we solve for that skills gap? You're talking to a virtual room full of people who are influential leaders in this space and have the ability to be thinking about not only themselves, what they can contribute, but how they can mobilize the collective efforts of their organization's resources. Can you share some examples of people who are doing a really good job at changing the game on this, and what it is that they're putting to work?
And two quick process points. One is I would just ask that you save the chat afterwards, because it turns out I cannot listen to your questions and read the chat at the same time. So I'd love to read what I missed, number one.
We will do that.
And number two, since we are virtually in Australia, where you sit in the front, not in the back of taxis, I would also ask that you call me Beth and not Professor Novak, please.
Done.
So in terms of what do we do in terms of investing in creating this skill building opportunities? So, you know, let me speak for a moment with reference to the United States. Because we're in some dire straits here, and we're in a much better situation there with things like the APS and the public sector review, with the fact that you have a digital transformation team and you have investments in the teaching of things like human-centered design and behavioral insights, and you have a strong lab culture. There's lots of great stuff happening in Australia. So to make you feel a little bit better, I'll tell you about the United States for a moment, where both at the federal and at the state level, we do not have any kind of training strategy. The government is the largest employer in the United States, and we have no training strategy. It is unthinkable, you know, if you go to work for IBM, you have to learn human-centered design. If you go to work for AT&T, they spend $250 million on training their employees. Training is part of a sales and product development strategy. It is surprisingly not part of how we think about policy and service delivery from the top down. So we lack any kind of pronouncements on this issue. You know, we're spending more money than we ever have in history, at least since World War II. But we're not talking about how we're going to effectively spend that money. So there's no executive order. Our legislation on public sector upskilling dates to 1958. The last time we had an executive order in this space from the president is 1994. So forget big data. We're talking like the internet wasn't something the government was thinking about. Like, we are way out of date. So first, the question is, what can we do in terms of top-down policy pronouncements? The second piece of this is, so I think a lot of more forward-leaning governments have pronouncements from the top that says this matters. Investment in the public sector matters. We care about the public sector. I won't get into the politics here of, there's obviously some left-right divide issues about the view of public sector and the view of public servants and the role of public servants that we could touch on. But regardless of party and you know, where you are in the political spectrum, you know, if you care about how we spend money and doing so efficiently, you should care about ensuring we have the efficiency to do so. It's not something that we're doing. It's why in the United States, we spent $100 million on McKinsey in the first 4 months of the pandemic, because there was a real view that public sector didn't have the skills that it took to be able to solve problems effectively. So that's a real it's a sort of telling story that I love to, it's a sort of factoid that I mention whenever I can, that just says we're not in the longer term, part of the lesson from the pandemic has to be, we have to create the skill set in the long term so that we don't have to do that. Since, as you may know, it's coming out in the news, as much as one may love or hate McKinsey, and I really like a lot of the individuals that I work with there, the news comes out every day about complicity around the opioid scandal and all kinds of other stuff that's going on there. But I think, you know, beyond the kind of top-down pronouncements, there's a lot of bottom-up stuff that we need to do. both to create access to free training resources, and I emphasize free because the cost, not simply cost to individuals, which may not be the issue, but cost to agency budgets and complexity of how you pay for training and whether there's a budget for it, it may not be there. So there's an importance of creating free, high quality resources. And there's the importance of creating then the incentives, because frankly, there's lots of free content. You want to upskill, you can go on edX, you can go on Coursera, you can come to the University of Melbourne and take a exec ed course. There's plenty of content, but there needs to be incentives. So so let me give you a couple of quick examples here. When it comes to free content, Germany is building, as is Canada, a digital academy, providing whole of government access to training resources and providing clear pathways through that material for people so that they know what they should take and why they should take it, and to make it free. But they're also creating incentives. So Argentina connects pay rises to the upskilling and training, and has really created momentum for people to do more learning. In Singapore, they've created incentives in a slightly different form. They basically make training very competitive. They make it very cool, like it's a super honor to get into a course. And they kind of really drill down on the notion that you're falling behind the private sector if you don't upskill. So that they create cultural incentives for people to learn in new ways. But they also create space and time for people to do this learning. And frankly, during COVID, it's been a lot to ask of people to say you should pause and actually take a class or learn something. It's very unrealistic for how we work in government, without creating the time for people to do things and creating the bite-sized products. Again, something they're doing in Canada is really bite-sized chunks, 15 minutes, as a way to really develop people's learning. But last said, I think I'm overselling the concept of training or learning by itself. What we're really focused on, and can't simply measure success by how many people took a class in data science or human-centered design, unless these things are connected to the better delivery of services and better delivery of policies, unless we're really thinking about how do we provide the coaching and support for people who work for us to get their projects implemented more quickly and in better ways, the training by itself is really not enough. So we really have to look at the culture and environment for innovation, for new ways of working, and what are the impediments that we may be facing in our agencies to new ways of working, and how we can move those out of the way, and what's the support that people need for really pushing through to implementation. So I think it's not just about training or learning, it's really about coaching and mentoring and the things we need to do to get us to real outcomes. So let me pause with that, because we'll never get to all the questions if I talk too much.
No, fantastic. Some great call outs there, both top down and bottom up. And a reminder as well, if you want to put your hand up and ask a question at any point, please do so. Now, Beth, we also took some questions as people signed up for this event, and there are a lot of people who were really eager to get your view on the misinformation, the decay of democracy. So I'm going to kind of combine a couple of the themes of the questions that we had, and you can do with it what you might like. So a lot of comments around technology being a contributor, or certainly something that's framed as a contributor to the decay of democracy. And so this question around how do we flip this? How do we utilize technology to strengthen and renew democracies? How do we turn the narrative around and perhaps the reality around? And the second one being around what do we need to do as groundwork for effective community engagement and innovation in the domains that are really affected by polarization, by misinformation. So a bit in that, but feel free to take a bite at either of those apples regarding sort of misinformation and decay.
Small questions. All right, misinformation and democracy. Good, no problem. So let's start with the second one. So effective community engagement. Oof. So I think it's really quick answers to these, but let me also say any question that you put to me, I think we should put to the group to also share your thoughts in the chat and what you're seeing and what your views are, as well as people who want to weigh in out loud as in addition. So effective community engagement, 3 quick comments there. One is the extraordinary importance of focusing on the problem that we're trying to solve. Now, the problem that we're trying to solve is often a very contested topic. gets back to the misinformation issue. There's a lot of disinformation about whether a problem exists and what is the problem. If we think about climate change, for example, or even mask wearing, the problem, defining the problem is itself extraordinarily politicized often. But it means we do need processes for getting to agreement about the problem that we're trying to solve, and then focusing people's attention on developing solutions for that problem. So it's why I've become such a fan of thinking about problem-solving processes, because they help us to get away from issues of politics. They get people really focused on, we're trying to take out the trash, we're trying to reduce traffic, we're trying to reduce COVID, we're trying to increase literacy. When we can get people focused on a problem, some people also like to think about this as missions. The kind of Mariana Mazzucato has popularized the whole concept of missions or challenges. It long predates her. But this whole idea of just getting us to a point where we're thinking about how do we increase childhood literacy by 3% in 6 months, or how do we decrease COVID by Y% in Z months. So really focusing on the problem is paramount, number one. Number two, ensuring that we have infrastructure to actually engage with communities. So I have seen time and time again, there's a great desire to engage with communities, but again, no idea which tools should I use, how do I use the tools, what's the process I should employ. In other words, how do I do this efficiently within the scope of my day job that could actually lead to actionable insights. So community engagement is very, sounds nice as a democratic nice to have, but unless it is a problem-solving must-have, unless we have efficient ways we can do these things, we're just not going to do more of it. And the third thing is the need to really, as my colleague says, and I don't know if this is an American expression or a universal expression, because I only know one person who says it, it's different horses for different courses. That is to say, we have to pick the right process for the thing we're trying to do in this context. So if we're trying to get people's input on what is the problem, we need a different process and platform than if we're trying to come up with solutions to a problem. And we often need to do both. So we're about to embark, for example, on a process of co-design between the residents of Oakland, California, and the city of Oakland, a project we've done in Africa and in Latin America, and now we're doing in the US for the first time. And we are starting with an engagement to ask residents to help us define the problems that we're then going to ask them to solve. 2 different processes, 2 different platforms, training around both to ensure that we that everybody's on the same page as to how we're doing it, because we have promised the mayor we will not only come up with solutions, but we will implement them in less than a year. So the reality in which we live is that we have short time frames, limited budgets, politicized and highly fraught environments. So engagement has to be efficient and effective, leading to the solving of problems. And so knowing what tools to use and combining them, and that often can involve combining, last point here, representative and non-representative forms of engagement. In Europe, all the rage now is the mini public. You've done a lot of mini publics in Australia, especially in South Australia. For example, the nuclear power mini public that was run there. So you get a lot of legitimacy from having a representative sample of citizens. But if what you really want is to get people's good ideas for how to solve the problem, you don't need a representative sample. You need the most enthusiastic, passionate people and the people with the know-how and the expertise. So you also need non-representative forms of engagement. So I'm a big fan of doing both. Because you often need, the combination of passion, you need the legitimacy and you need the know-how that you get from doing these 2 things together. So, oh my God, that was just one question. Shoot, disinformation. I think it's the same answer to the disinformation question. So disinformation has such a huge number of really attendant root causes that have to do with social media and social media financing models and the cognitive psychology of how, keeping eyeballs the way the media wants to give us, the things that cause us to watch more Facebook. So there's a whole load of stuff that really touches on a broader range of policy issues beyond just kind of our remit here today. So bracketing all of that out, and which is a very huge caveat to what we're talking about, I think that really having processes that are sort of well designed are really what's centrally important to creating a healthy kind of engagement process. If we just ask people, what's your opinion on something, you're going to get all manner of rubbish. But if you're actually asking people to do things like tell you which is the greater problem for them in how they experience it, or to come up with a solution to a problem that has been defined with data, if you design the process really well, you actually get really, really high quality engagement and next to no problems with disinformation. So I think it's really a design issue, and the more the short of it is, if you just ask people, what do you think about something, you're going to get spouted back to you all of the rubbish that they read on Facebook. And if you actually focus them on a much more kind of defined way of addressing a challenge, you'll get really high quality input. To give you a 10-second example, we did an engagement around how the greatest challenges for parents, caregivers, students, and educators around their child's education during COVID. And we gave people 50 statements to choose from using a particular tool called a wiki survey tool, which is open source. And they were asked, which of these things was the most important to you? They were free to write something else and to add their own comments, but because we had a set of 50 statements that were pre-drafted, it made it very, very easy for people to participate in ways that led to really meaningful input for us as policymakers, without a lot of noise. So there are ways to kind of constrain the process so that you get a high signal and low noise in the process.
I love those pieces there around how we define and refine the process. We've got a question that's come through from Sarah in the chat. She's asked, I'm curious about how you see the role of university research in partnering with governments to engage citizens in addressing real world pressing problems. And she's given the context that she's a human-computer interaction researcher and user-centered design is her personal bread and butter approach to research. Any thoughts on that?
Yes, it's so, and this gets to one of the questions, it ties in, it's a very nice segue to the misinformation and disinformation question as well, is we don't have very effective pathways now to connect university researchers to policymakers. Now in Australia, you have, you will know the name of it better than I do, but you have something like Science Day at the legislature where you connect scientists to parliamentarians, for example, for informal learning around science. It's a model we're looking at here to see how we copy it. Somebody in the chat may remember the name of this, but I think about it as Science Day at Parliament. I don't know whether the scientists come to Canberra or they, or it's nowadays done online. But there are, it's a mechanism for trying to connect policymakers, researchers to policymakers. There's work, for example, that's done at Monash University through the MSDI program to train researchers how to write and speak for policymakers. The conversation, which emerged from Australia and is now all over the world, is used to help translate university research into a format that's useful for policymakers, i.e., 1 page instead of 100 pages, bottom line up front, but we're not doing things as a general matter across universities to do things like teach policymakers how to teach university researchers how to write policy memos, to teach them how to capture their research in a page, to teach them how to write op-eds. We're also not doing enough on the government side to articulate questions in a timely fashion to the science community and to the research community, nor are we providing funding to the research and science community to produce research in formats that are, again, useful and timely and agile for policymakers. There are, again, some efforts, there are some networks, there's something called the National Science Policy Network coming out of the US, and also the Science Scholars Strategy Network, both of which have become quite global, one at connecting scientists and the other at connecting scholars more generally, that are attempting to act as middle persons and be a bridge between policymakers and the research community. But it's really something that we need to do a bit better job at, both from the demand side on the part of policymakers, but also from the supply side on the part of universities. Look, universities judge faculty and PhD students and others by their ability to publish in academic journals. And until we include and think about real world impact and things like, we do ask people about service, but generally that means service to the university. Real world impact is not traditionally a metric in how we're thinking about what researchers do. So it's a huge open field. And I think especially with COVID, with George Floyd, and world events, I think universities are hungry now to become more impactful in the real world.
Tim, I can see you've got your hand up. Do you want to jump in and ask a question?
Thanks, Beth. I just wanted to ask, because I think at our university, one of the things we've been thinking about is how do we create spaces for the public to come to our university so we can partner and then go out and do some of the amazing work you're speaking about. But we found that there are so many barriers, if it's the ivory tower perception or if it's the ethics review process. And I was wondering, do you have any insights or tips of how universities can just be more welcoming places for everyday people?
It's really interesting because today I was proofing the final report for our Future of Work task force, which had a bunch of academics on it. And I just said to the team, like, all the academics are listed with all of their honorifics, PhD, blah, 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 doctor of this and that. I'm like, can we take that off? It is so alienating, your point about the ivory tower. And especially when we're making the point that equally important to credentials and book learning is real world experience. So I think it starts with saying, you know, we care about your experience as equally valid and important. And you are the experts in your neighborhood, in your community, in your disease that you suffer from, or the, you know, as recipients of a service. I mean, it's central to the whole notion of human-centered design. It's central to how HCI researchers do their work, to the last question, to really just sort of celebrate and elevate community learning and expertise, number one. Number two, we can take a page from what's been learned around citizen science and civic science. That is to say, citizen science is where the university researcher says, I, the wanted researcher, will now ask you, the citizen, to help me, you know, look at birds or tag photographs or you know, help me with my research project. Civic science is where the citizens define the question, define the research. And so true community engaged research is not about researchers simply going to talk to communities. It's about researchers talking with communities about what the problem is that we should solve together. It is not something, again, that researchers are trained in doing. So I have a colleague at the Dukakis Center, named after the former governor of Massachusetts, Michael Dukakis, and the former presidential candidate. So the Dukakis Center, named Alicia Modestino, who has a considerable size grant right now to train university researchers in how to be more community engaged. And there's some great people that I can think of who are truly community engaged researchers, who are, again, defining the problem with communities rather than saying, here's the finished research project, now, you know, you should go help us with it, or we're now going to treat you as a focus group, or we're just going to interview you like a lab rat or a research subject. But is to say, let's sit down and actually define what the problem is together that we want to solve, and let us work for you rather than the other way around. So but again, I think we have to not be too harsh on ourselves. That's where I come back to the point about these skills not being innate, is we have to have a healthy dose of kindness, if you will, to say, look, none of us learned how to do this. We weren't trained in it in school. We weren't trained in it necessarily on the job, but it is something it's a set of skills we can still develop now and learn as we go. But it starts by saying your lived experience is equally, if not more important and valid as our 3 PhDs and, or our fancy credentials.
Beth, we've got another question that's come through from you, and Georgia also commented to say it's called Science Meets Parliament, the name of the program you were thinking of. Paul's asked, or commented first, digital platforms are increasingly important in delivering public sector outcomes, but are largely delivered or controlled by the private sector. What do you think the government's role is in platforms moving forward? Is it still regulation or government as a platform when you think about the lens moving forward?
Oh, that's such a good question, and I'd love your answer to that if you have one. We struggle with this question. There are things where, and inherent in the question, I'll sort of, this is, the question already says this, but I will just say what we're struggling with right now. So we were, in my team in New Jersey, we were very keen, based on some university research and some work that had been done in universities, very interested in the idea of providing virtual coaching for the long-term unemployed. Something we wanted to do before COVID. It was based on, again, university experiments that showed that mentoring really helps people who have been chronically unemployed to get back to work. And we thought we really need to build this ourselves because in order to do this well, we have to collect personal information from people. And we cannot trust, frankly, the private sector to handle people's private information appropriately, nor can we trust the private sector to give people independent recommendations, instead of pushing them a product or selling them something. At the same time, so we're like, we have to go out and build this, and we have to build it as the state, and we have to own it. I mean, we might contract developers to help us to build it, but we have to make it our platform. The other side of this is then we said, well, we're not very good at building this platform. We're not fast enough at it. We're not agile enough at it. There are a lot of people building tools for workers, ranging from the global behemoths like LinkedIn to smaller groups like Bob Emploi in France. That's been doing exactly this, building coaching tools for people. And so part of this is to say there isn't one answer to this. I do think that the part of the ethos of government as a platform, though, isn't just the question of do we build it or do we let the private sector build it? It's also questions of in what ways do we enable, can we enable the freeing up of the data that can allow people to build better tools? In what ways are we setting the conditions about how that development happens, to say, as the government, we won't recommend it, we won't use it unless you build it according to a set of regulations and conditions that we're going to set out. So there's a lot we can do with our power as a market player and as the kind of a big megaphone on the block to get the private sector to do things in a better way. But I still think that there are case-by-case decisions depending on the nature of the tool and the platform where we really have to decide, is this something we have to own or is this something that we have to support or enable? But I'd be interested in your own comments or reflections or answers to your own question.
There you go, Paul. Feel free to put a response there in the chat, and others too. And we should have set up front too, for those who wish to stay around, we'll have some additional time at the conclusion of the conversation for some breakout rooms where we can get into more detailed discussion and share experiences and thoughts. I'm just going to combine again, Beth, a couple of streams of sort of the question themes that came through pre our conversation, and then we're kind of conscious of time. A lot around public participation models, specifically, someone sort of saying, look, when I think of public engagement, I think of participatory budget programs like what's happening in Brazil. Are there other models that we can be learning from, and what role should technology play in enabling these models? And similarly, ones around building the capacity of the public for public engagement versus this idea of one-off sort of extractive engagements. How do we build that public capacity? So participation and engagement, any thoughts around those two things?
Yeah, so let me try to share 2 links in the chat if I can multitask effectively. So the first link I'm going to share is for a series of case studies that we did focused on, this is on the academic side now, that we're focused on places that have institutionalized the use of citizen engagement. So you'll also find something we did together with Nesta in the UK. So you'll find a very short guide of a couple pages, a longer report, and then a bunch of case studies, all of which were then focused on places that have gone from using citizen engagement as a one-off, event into something that becomes the kind of standard way of doing things. And then I will also put in the chat, in case you are like me, too busy to read anything, and want to just listen, we have been interviewing the people who have led these programs and created a podcast series. So if you just want to, Peter's in the car or walking. So for the people who want to learn on the go and want to just listen to something, I recommend the podcast version. I don't know about you. I used to read at one point in time. Now I feel like I don't read anything anymore. We read all the time, and therefore we never read anything. Is what's happened. But I think there are lessons learned, and we tried to capture some of those about the places that have been able to institutionalize engagement and why that's worked. And it comes down to basically two top line messages. One is it has to be efficient and effective. And, this to connect back to what we said before, it has to solve a problem for a politician. Otherwise, it's always going to be a nice to have instead of a must have. And the second thing is you just have to have a clear set of processes and pathways for doing it, which is not a simple thing. That's where what I'm calling civic infrastructure comes in. Access to the tools and platforms, access to the know-how, access to the support to help you to do it. By the way, Timothy gets back to a place that universities, I think, can really be helpful because we can procure the platforms, we can provide some of that know-how, we can also provide some of the evaluation that can really help beleaguered policymakers do this more easily. Can be very helpful. So I think that gets to the institutionalization question. And then Holly, remind me, what was the first question?
The first question was really around other examples of public participation models. So in addition to what we're seeing in Brazil with budgetary processes there, what role should technology play in these processes? And is there anything else people can look to as examples?
So I think I have a zillion links I could put in the chat here, but I'll give you, I think it comes down to basically, again, this comment of different models for different problem solving stages. So I would say, and they divide really into this question of representative models, the mini public, the citizen assembly, basically the bigger mini public, that are quite interesting in terms of how those are used to build legitimacy. But then there are the models that are not representative. I am particularly excited, though, about the models that really focus on collective action rather than on collective deliberation. So in the link I put in the chat around those collective intelligence cases, and for those people who are walking and not, or not looking at the chat or whatnot, let me just say out loud, it's some of the best examples are coming from places like Helsinki, or there's a case here from Lakewood, Colorado. Actually, there's a whole bunch of things here that are much more focused on getting citizens to do things together. So in Helsinki, they're getting citizens, it's not just about getting people into a room, virtual or otherwise, to talk. The most exciting models are, like in Lakewood, Colorado, they are going out and getting citizens to do sustainability and climate change projects together in a collective way. In Helsinki, similarly around climate, they are getting citizens both to help set targets around climate and then to actually police what government is doing and then to engage in sustainability and climate projects. I love projects like, I'm not sure if there's a UK version of this called Good Sam, and in the US it is called, I'm forgetting the name, but the Good Sam project in the UK essentially focuses on getting citizens to provide bystander CPR to somebody suffering cardiac arrest or to use a defibrillator. So some of the other models, let me say, are more collective action oriented rather than collective deliberation oriented. So that's one distinction I would draw. Another distinction that I like is some of the things that are really interesting are just really, really lightweight And I will put one more link in the chat here, which is to the education project that we recently did. If I can find it at the same time, where we used 4 different forms of engagement. And again, to provide different ways for people to engage. So 2 cool things to point you to here. The first one was 3 things. One is we used a mini public because we got together a representative sample of 20 kids to help us run this project because it was youth related. Barcelona is doing something now on youth engagement, but the second thing we did was to use this wiki survey tool where we provided the 50 statements, and the tool would give you pairwise 2 statements and to ask you which of these is the more urgent challenge from your perspective, and you kind of keep voting on statements one after the other. So it's a really, really lightweight and easy to participate. Some of you may have heard of, somebody wrote about V-Taiwan in the chat. They use a similar tool called Polis, which I think also has offices in Australia, pol.is. We used a tool called All Our Ideas, both open source. But then we used a tool called Remesh. It's a brand new company, no endorsement implied here. I am a customer of theirs, not a promoter. But Remesh uses artificial intelligence and machine learning to be able to allow you to do essentially a deliberative engagement with citizens in a 1-hour period. So we talked to 500 people in the space of, we did 2 1-hour engagements, talked to 500 people. We did not just a representative sample, but we oversampled for communities of color. But it was very, very easy for us to run because of the machine learning element of the tools. And similarly, if you wanted to do something around open innovation or ideation, there's a lot of great tools out of Iceland. There's something called Your Priorities, which comes from a nonprofit called Citizens Foundation. And then full disclosure, I'm on the board of a small Belgian company called Citizen Lab, run by these great young people from Belgium who are doing a lot of work in Europe on, again, providing platforms for open ideation for people. So long story short, happy to provide offline more examples of tools. We have all this stuff online, but it's really just about figuring out what is it you're trying to accomplish and picking the right tool for the purpose. But there are a lot of things out there now. They're cheap or free. They're really easy to use. They have companies sometimes that provide support services, and there are ways of doing things that are fast.
I'm sure we will take up that offer to send through some more offline links, and we'll certainly consolidate all the ones that you've already shared in terms of being able to feed that back to the group that have attended today and those that couldn't be here. So I'm going to throw in now to Timothy, because amazingly we've managed to speed through an hour. Beth, it's been such a pleasure to be in conversation with you. Thank you so much for the generosity of the time that you've shared and the insights that you've offered. And to give a more formal vote of thanks and to offer up a closing poll, Timothy, it's back to you.
Thanks so much, Beth, and thanks, Holly, for facilitating the discussion. This has been really, really insightful for me, but I think for many on the call, and I think that's shown by all of the comments in the chat. I guess my key takeaways as I was reflecting just then on all the things I've been writing down is that this engagement is hard work, but it's worthwhile work. And if you get it right, you can do so much. And I think that's just shown by the way that many governments internationally are looking to different ways of doing engagement. I love the idea of representative and non-representative forms of engagement, and actually thinking about what's needed in the context. And I know in the academic sense, I'm always fearful of extractive processes of engagement, but actually thinking about how we can just get out of the way and use our power as academics to put the processes and platforms in place for communities to do what they want to do. The other thing I just was really just in terms of the public sector and the things we're trying to do at the School of Government is not having one-off upskilling opportunities, but creating a learning public service where there's opportunities to learn and upskill. And it's not just, as one person said in the chat, a 3-hour or a 3-day workshop. It's built into the process. So you'll see in the chat that I've posted a link for you to share your thoughts. So I'd love you to jump onto that poll everywhere and just share things that you might do differently in your practice or in your work. What we're going to do now is is, once we say farewell, Beth, to go enjoy her evening, even though I know it's very cold in New York. We're going to break out into some breakout rooms if you're able to stick around, because I'd love you to meet everyone on the call and also share with everyone on the call what you took away from today's discussion and what you're going to go back and tell everyone else in your office about, if that's a virtual office or a real office. So before we do that, thank you, Beth. I don't know if you had any final thoughts or any things to leave us with. We've really valued the time you've contributed today to the discussion.
To thank you for the robust discussion. I'm catching up on the chat here, but if you would be so kind again to save it and to send it to me. There's so many great and useful links in here, and I've put my contact info in there. So if there's anything I've mentioned, like what was that platform from Iceland, don't hesitate to contact me, and I will be happy to share any follow-up links or ideas. And just, it's a pleasure to be with you, and I look forward to being back in Australia in person before too long, COVID permitting.
Wonderful. Thanks, Beth. And we're really hoping that we can see you in person soon.